Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen, your host. Thank you for joining us for another installment. We have another guest. Actually, we've been trying to have more guests on the podcast. I really actually enjoy having those like monologues and dialogues with our audience because it just really feels like there's almost this like one-to-one connection to the folks listening to this. But I also know that it's really beneficial for folks to hear from a multitude of perspectives. And so we've been trying our best to get our friends, our colleagues, the folks that we are really excited about the work that they're doing in the psychedelic space onto the show. And so we have a guest here, my friend Mareesa Stertz. Mareesa is a filmmaker, storyteller, artist, community organizer, who's been dedicated to fostering collective healing and transformation in psychedelics. As a co-founder of the Global Psychedelic Society and Lucid News, Mareesa has been building platforms that destigmatize, educate, and build community around psychedelics, drawing from her own journey of trauma and transformation. Mareesa is passionate about the use of storytelling and art and play, which we'll talk about to deepen the understanding of the healing processes and finding wholeness, of which I know you shared some of your experiences on international stages and through teaching, workshops, and retreats. Mareesa's done some film work, producing and hosting documentary series that can be found on Gaia TV and Amazon. And the most excited thing, which I'm looking forward to learning more about, is bringing a large-scale immersive art project called the Sphinx Gate to Burning Man in 2025. So Mareesa, thanks for joining us here on the episode.
Thanks for having me. I'm such a delight.
Yeah, we met through effectively Burning Man community as well. I think that's where you and I had first met and kind of had been interweaving into like the cross sections of our own communities, myself being there for like a harm reduction aspect. But then I also, know that in these big events, there's just so many like artists and storytellers and all of that. So I wonder if you could, share for the audience what's brought you into, this intersection of psychedelics. Like, how did psychedelics get woven into a lot of this work that you do?
Honestly, psychedelics have been a part of my life since I was 15. I did mushrooms at a Steve Miller Band concert, and
wow.
I was like, this is really cool. I was a little hippie kid for a couple of years in high school, and I immediately appreciated them. And at the same time, they were very unpredictable, sometimes opening up things and getting me out of my head in ways that felt really cathartic and helpful. And other times magnifying my pain in ways that I didn't understand how to deal with. And I didn't understand when I was just like, I'm so broken, psychedelics don't work for me. What's going on here? And I was lacking role models or teachers or guides around me. We were doing this all at festivals and parties and so at Burning Man. And so I kind of put them on a shelf until maybe 10 years ago when I followed the breadcrumbs and met folks using psychedelics intentionally, ceremonially, but also playfully. Everyone would gather. This was in Los Angeles. 20, 30 people would gather at a house. Facilitator would set the stage with a little mini lecture, a theme, and then everyone would receive different medicines and we'd set sail. And it was really hard at first and uncomfortable. The first couple times I maybe went once and I was like, that's weird. Those people are weird. I'm not coming back. And then maybe about a year later, I was like, well, let's try it again. The first time was like a big headache. It hurt my system, which had been a theme, which is why I put them on the shelf. It just like magnified pain so much. And so as I slowly started coming back more and more, I was getting into documentary filmmaking at the time. And I was just like, oh my God, the world needs to know what is possible here.
Yeah.
The psychedelics were helping shift all these places inside of me that were feeling very stuck. And I had spent from the day from probably 18 on to like 35, very much searching for a way to shift it. And any therapist, any yoga and meditation, any of the things that I'd found didn't really fit right. And so once I rediscovered psychedelics, I was like, okay, this is the key for me. And I'd really like to help others who are struggling similar to me. And so it became, I've woven in my work with psychedelics and what they have taught me into storytelling, into making films that help others understand how these tools work,
Mm.
into creating platforms that help make sure this education and community container is available for anyone who is desiring it so they can make informed decisions and do it in community, because these are all the pieces that I was missing.
Yeah. Those 20 to 30 people gatherings are probably somebody's greatest dream and also somebody else's like biggest nightmare, you know? Like it's such like depends on the ingredients that all go into the soup, right? And like everybody brings their own set of work and perspectives and beliefs and the things that they want out of, psychedelic experiences. So it's pretty interesting, to me that you kind of dove into that a little bit and then you're like, oh, that's not for me. But then something was bringing you back maybe.
Yeah. It didn't only happen in those containers, but there's one exception to this like pause I took with psychedelics, which is I was introduced to ayahuasca. It was 2007. So my God, almost like 18 years ago. And I took it and I had no mental breakthrough. And it felt really strange and also, again, really uncomfortable and weird. And then I went back the next year when this group came through. I was living in San Francisco and in Marin at the time. I came back the next year and again, it didn't seem to work right. And a few years later, I sat 2 nights in a row. I did the dieta. It was very well-held container. All of them were. And it didn't seem to work. And there has
Sure.
been this sort of thread of, I don't know, come back, try again, try again. And it took me years and years to be on the other side, many years through it. And as well as, I went to the Amazon. I did several dietas. I sat a lot. I worked concertedly on this blockage that I had in my system that was making the medicine seem to not work, right?
Mm.
And once I was on the other side of it, I looked back at all these occasions where I thought it wasn't working right. And I'm like, oh my God, the first time I did ayahuasca is when I got over my debilitating shyness. I used to be really, really shy. I couldn't look people in the eyes. I didn't believe in myself. And that first time of doing ayahuasca, I didn't understand it for years and then afterwards I was looking at my journals and putting things together and I'm like, my God, it all went away that year.
Yeah.
Not completely, but enough. And I could suddenly look people in the eye. And so all these times I thought it didn't work, even though it didn't give me some big grandiose experience. And I didn't have these epiphanies that so many others were walking away with. Little micro shifts were happening, or in this case with the shyness, it was a big one. But they were happening at a speed that I couldn't quite measure when I was living it. And I could only see from the other side.
Or whether you even allow yourself to acknowledge that a change had occurred until you look back later.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I think that there's a lot of people who romanticize big breakthroughs. I think that we as a society, it shows up in film and movies and all of these things about these big heroic like breakthroughs and oftentimes I tell folks like a lot of this work happens in the mundane. It happens like when you're brushing your teeth or when you're cleaning your house or when you're doing a chore and whatnot. And I think that's really powerful because I also can imagine in your shoes and for a lot of folks that I chat with, even just building up enough courage to have the possibility of hope, because hope is this interesting double-edged sword. Because if you have hope, then that also means that you can be let down. But if you don't have hope, you also can't get over to the next thing. And so I see a lot of folks like we chat with who are like, man, this is giving me hope. And also like, that's really scary because like, I don't know if I can deal with that fall if it doesn't work. I kind of hear that in the theme of what you're saying too.
I mean, and this is why I think storytelling is so important for many reasons, is just like, I wish people had told me, hey, because I came to those initial ayahuasca journeys very desperate, very feeling broken. And everything I had tried hadn't worked. And so when it didn't work, seemed to not work, for those of you listening, I'm giving those quotation marks.
The air quotes.
The air quotes. It's funny. People tell you to. They're just like, don't expect something big. You can hear it, but you can't really hear it. And I'm just like, I sat with ayahuasca 7 times over the course of 12 years, and it didn't seem to work. And then once I did this, like going to the jungle and doing these big things, I had some big shifts. I had some big journeys. And then I went back to many journeys that were extraordinarily boring and mundane, where I was curled up in a ball processing all the unprocessed emotions. My understanding is all the unprocessed experiences and pain, not only in my life, but maybe in my ancestral lineage, just sitting in fetal position, getting to be with that, witnessing it so it can move on and
Hmm.
process and not be stuck emotionally constipated in my system the way I'd lived my whole life. And those journeys were not full of visuals. They were not full of interesting things. They were not even full of like demons or scary things. It was just uncomfortable, me stuck in my head and the looping parts of my brain where I was judging and mean to myself and all the things that we do to ourselves that we've learned from systems around us, from our parents, from, they're the best with tools we had at the time. If I shame myself, I'll do a better job because I don't want
Yeah.
to, but it doesn't really work very well.
Yeah, I play around with this term negative reinforcement. Everybody's so focused on positive reinforcements, and that negative reinforcements is really interesting underbelly that that is, embedded into a lot of aspects of folks' lives. I'm curious, like what made that shift for you? I'm hearing that throughout a lot of your experiences were approached intentionally. You were saying like very well held containers, but it seemed to have at some point this shift of this is not working to, oh, I think it might be working. And I'm curious what flipped that switch for you.
I think I was ready in my own growth to really face head to head some of my own personal programs and conditionings that lived in my unconscious all my life. I wasn't aware of them. I actually was on a film shoot in Panama. I was in a documentary film shoot, and I managed to orchestrate a life situation that was very, very reminiscent of some childhood stuff, where like I felt like everything I was doing was not good enough, and
Mm.
I wanted very much to please. But like my skills as a documentary filmmaker at the time weren't that great. Like this level of documentary filmmaking was very nuanced. It was like you have one camera, you have to film people having a conversation. You have to get all these different angles. You have to anticipate who's going to speak next. You have to get good sound recording. I was following a bunch of 18-year-olds around the jungle as they were building a village. So it was just an extraordinarily challenging set of circumstances during rainy season in Panama. And I burnt myself out
Mm.
deeply. And I had like throughout the course of that film shoot so much anxiety and so much insecurity and so much just feeling like everything I was doing was not good enough, which was a lot of like programming that I experienced in my childhood as well. And
Mm.
so to recreate it, like I hit a rock bottom moment of deep depression, of deep feeling like a failure. And I quit that job halfway through. Although I was doing bad, I wasn't doing bad enough to get fired. But I quit, and then I had a subletter in LA. I had all this time, and I had earned some money, and I was like, okay, I feel really broken. I was like so chronically fatigued. I had zero energy. I like spent several weeks in Panama at a hostel just trying to figure out what to do next, but sleeping almost all the time.
Mm.
And then I was just like, ayahuasca, let's go. And so I went to Peru for the first time ever, barely knowing what I was getting into. Landed in Iquitos, really pretty clueless. I woke up in the morning in the hostel and was just like, oh my God, what if I have like malaria? I should be worried about, like, I didn't check for the immunizations or if there's something I should be worried about. Anyway, it was all fine. And I just followed this gut intuition, I went to a hostel, met a bunch of travelers who had all been sitting with different curanderos and was like, I want to go do a dieta. I want to get to the bottom of what's keeping me so stuck. I want to understand this. Like, no amount of thinking is bringing clarity to me. And this is actually what, I have a feature film that I've been like working on putting together. I filmed all of this process
Mm.
because I was stuck, couldn't find my way out, couldn't think myself out of it. And then I went on this great adventure to figure it out. And so I traveled with my new friends to wherever they were sitting with medicine folks and sat in ayahuasca until I found two people, two different centers that I really liked. And I loved the way they were showing up, the energy they brought. And so I did a 1-week dieta with one woman, Dona Atilia. It's on the road to Nalta, like an hour and a half out of Iquitos. And then in the other direction, a center called Spiritual Dimensions and Javier Averelo. I did 1-week dietas with both of them and like, isolation, just drinking different master plants, chronically fatigued, super ran down, but like just pushing myself through this. And it was after 3 or 4 journeys that and I think maybe some Toei was involved in the ayahuasca or some black ayahuasca.
Mm.
They were like, all right, this lady is really like very rigidly protected by her mind or whatever and won't let anything in. We're going to give her the strong stuff. And so eventually I broke through and I had like a really profound experience. The spirit of ayahuasca came to me in almost a form, asked me if I wanted to create life. I was like, is this like immaculate conception? What are we talking about here? I was in a very, very altered state. And it felt just so right. And so I said yes. And a hummingbird appeared and poured an elixir down my throat. And, this feeling of like the spirit of communication is coming to you, which at this moment was so profound because I had spent my whole life wanting to tell stories, wanting to say and create things and tell narratives, and I had never been very good at it. Like, I made all these beautiful music videos, but I couldn't figure story out to save my life. Didn't understand story. And then with this experience, about 9 months later, I had received some funding from Mary Jane, the initial funders of the documentary series that now is on Gaia TV. And, they gave me the green light to shoot The Healing Powers, where I then continued to tell these stories and sort of Anthony Bourdain how psychedelics work and take people on this journey. But yeah, to answer your question, it's just very much following the pull to work with the medicine. And I think I had done the prep work already and just living out all my traumas, hitting my rock bottom moment, that the medicine and the circumstances were finally like primed up to like help me start to see some of those unconscious things and just have this breakthrough enough of the old programming to break through.
I find it really, really poignant that you were figuratively and literally pointing the lens at yourself. It's pretty interesting that like juxtaposition of like not feeling good enough for the project or feeling like you were bad at crafting story, but then at least having enough intuition to know like I want to document this. Like I want to categorize this, somehow. What I know about your work is that there's kind of this emphasis around 3 things from what I can gather is art, storytelling, and community, of which I kind of see you having a little or a large project in each of those categories. And so, you're talking about this like...
And psychedelics, we should name that in there too. If we can
Well, I
create a
kind of
pot
like
of...
view that as a blanket across everything that you do.
Okay.
That's why I was
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
starting this thing. I was like, how did psychedelics get infused into all of this? Because, like, I really like what you're sharing aligns with my philosophy, which is like psychedelics become this microcosm of the things that we're experiencing in real life, not the other way around. And so like the tools and skills that we can use to navigate these psychedelic experiences, they're the same ones to navigate life. And so when I think about that documentary thing you're talking about, when I think about all these interesting projects that you have, I was like, oh, those to me seem like the psychedelic experiences of which you're expressing yourself, which I think is kind of like the whole point with psychedelics is like, how do people express themselves in ways that they don't allow themselves to express,
Well, I got a juicy piece to add into that. The hero's journey mimics the mushroom journey. Or sorry, how the mushroom journey mimics the hero's journey. And this idea that like, for those maybe not so familiar with the hero's journey, the idea is that we begin in the known world where all is predictable. And then we embark on a series of challenges. Those challenges build into a critical mass where we land in the abyss, where we just feel like complete failures. But eventually you're there long enough and you start to have insight, revelation, and you make your way out. And, a mushroom journey will often take you into some fear you have that you didn't even really maybe name totally, or maybe you did, maybe you have a fear, but it's going to blow it up sometimes. It's going to magnify it and bring it really big into your face so you can maybe become fully conscious of it or see all aspects of what fear you might have held inside of you. And then it is after you become fully conscious of it that you can move through it. That belief I named for you before, the one of I'm not good enough and everything I was building was built on that. I don't think until I had the big journey where I was like, I am so broken. I am flawed beyond repair. I actually thought I was, I thought I had like a big illness at the time. I didn't, but the medicine journey just reflected to the depths of degree that I unconsciously held all these beliefs about myself.
Mm.
And it was this big grieving journey where I was just like, I might die soon. I don't know, and then it was after that that I was able to go, well, I'm still here. What am I going to do with what I have right now?
Yeah.
And how am I going to make the most of what I got, even if I did die? Maybe even if I am ill, like, then what? Let's do something with what we do have. And, I began to just follow that cycle of the hero's journey. So it's really lovely to see that, one, studies are reflecting this. And
Mm.
two, the work I'm doing with the storytelling, I spent from 18 on to 35 feeling broken without a clue on how to get out of it. And then I rediscovered psychedelics. But I was always looking for a map. I was wanting something to make sense of it. And this is why story is so exciting, because there's another study that shows tens of thousands of participants report an increased sense of meaning of life when they look at life through the lens of the hero's journey, which means the abyss, your breakdown, your illness, your heartbreak, your depression, whatever it is, maybe it's not some random shitty thing that happened to you. Maybe it is the rite of passage that you needed to become fully aware of whatever unconscious beliefs and programs you inherited from your childhood, from your caregivers, from all the belief systems we are embedded with, all the stories we inherit, and that you need to navigate that abyss in order to become aware of the unconscious and become more conscious and more sovereign. So you can be an agent of change and stop being ran by those inherited stories.
Yeah, there's a lot of concepts and themes of like agency and power, I think, within what, you're sharing, and you're adding a much like more nuanced lens than I have. We've done a hero's journey episode on this, podcast where I kind of like skim the surface and cover the basics, and one of the things that I think is important here in our dialogue, I'm reminded my therapist is actually pointing this out to me, where there are these certain themes and stories and things that just like vibrate with our humanity almost. It's like within our human experience, we're just geared to understand certain motifs, or, it's why we hear music a certain way. It's like there are things that just like make sense to us, right? What my therapist was like, well, you don't got to start this from scratch. You can use examples from history in story and all of that, of which this hero's journey is, I believe, like so vital. So I really appreciate you, bringing that connection there. And I know that you do your own, work with folks. I think you have a workshop coming up here soon, this storytelling catharsis. And then also I know that you have a lot of really intriguing thoughts about kind of two parts of this, if we can shift gears to talk about the storytelling a little bit, because I'm noting what you were saying at the beginning of your share, which was like, I think that this happens to a lot of folks who have psychedelic experiences, where they just kind of want to like shout it from the rooftops, you know but it depends on how you do it. It depends on your audience. It depends on what you're looking to get out of it. So I kind of see storytelling as kind of like two parts. One is the expression of the thing, right? Like, let me share for my own purposes, for processing. And I think the other is a little bit more related to that almost like community aspect, like storytelling as a way to like relate to other folks. So can you give us like a little bit of a breakdown on what your core work is here in storytelling? Like, what's the most important for folks who are about to embark on a psychedelic experience? Maybe they've come out of one. Like, what would be the most important things that you would impart to some of those folks?
Well, you know what? I'm going to name this one piece because it's in my head and I'm notoriously bad for promoting the things I'm doing. I'll just, to follow up on your opening, is on May 21st at 5:30 online is a free workshop inviting people to frame their stories and share them with each other.
Yeah, we'll put a link in the bio of this episode, and then we'll make sure that folks have a way to connect into some of your work.
Awesome. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting nuanced thing that took me years of like offering storytelling stuff to start getting even more clear about where do the lines fall. Mark Gaffney, he's a good, great thinker here, shares this poem, "Life is not a fact, it's a story." And it's divided in, I don't know, this is maybe not a poem, but life is not a fact, it's a story. And it's divided into 3 stages. Pre-tragic, where we perform. Tragic, where we come to terms with the farce. And post-tragic, where we stop performing. And
Mm,
I find this to be a very useful way of looking at our own lives and looking at the story of our lives. And it also overlaps with the hero's journey again. In the known world, we inherit the stories of our environment, all the ways we're taught to behave, the ways we relate into our siblings, to our environment. I have to work really hard to prove myself, or whatever the story is. And then we spend our lives, this next chunk, performing all of this inherited conditioning
mm,
until at some point, that abyss moment, we hit the fact of that this is tragic. Like these conditions, not all of them, not all the conditioning is not bad, but the ones that disconnect you from trusting yourself, that brings you into that moment of tragedy, of heartbreak, of like, wow, how terrible it is when I live my life needing to prove my worth. I'm not good enough, and really sitting with that heaviness. And then once you sit there long enough, you come to terms with it. So, and you begin to write a new story from that sovereign place
mm.
because you've now finished the whole thing. Wow, I'm even kind of forgetting exactly your question.
So what I'm hearing you say, my question was like, what are good principles of which people can like understand their stories? And like the first thing that you said noted to this like performative nature, which you took a way different spin on it. But one thing that I'll note is that people who go through psychedelic experiences, because of all the hype, because of all the possibility and wonder that people see, I totally have seen a performative aspect of this where there's a lot of pressure for people to be a success story or talk about how
Hmm.
impactful or amazing it was and whatnot, even if it might not have been as profound or groundbreaking for folks. And what I hear you talking about is this different framework where the
Hmm.
initial stories are the ones that were essentially handed down to us through environment or those who taught us. And then there's this phase of us acting out those stories. And then there's this part where we kind of have a choice of what stories we put down and what stories we carry forward. Maybe that third piece of we stop performing. So what I'm kind of putting together here is like most folks exploring psychedelic experiences are somewhere in that like stage 2 to stage 3 part.
Yeah, I definitely hear you. With the performing the story part of it in the performative way, or rather, like I think I was guilty of it myself. And here's the thing: it's like, well, basically, like I was so hungry for healing, and I also have this desire to tell stories. And so while I was, I think it was 2018, I spoke at a conference, and I haven't worked up the nerve to watch the conference footage again, but I think I'd be cringing left and right because I was not ready yet. Me now looks at me then and says, yeah, you were still feeling very victimized and
Mm,
you were still blaming the world outside of you, which I don't want to knock down. I think it's a very natural and important rung on the ladder of growth. One must be the victim. I think it's an important part of the story. I think until we are fully the victim and allow ourselves to do that part of the process, you can't move on to the next steps on the ladder. So no shame to the victim stage. But I don't recommend getting on stage and talking while you are still in the victim stage because it was still unprocessed. What happens when people with unprocessed stuff get on the stage is, either they're going to overly credit the medicine or the curandero, or they don't really understand the bigger picture yet because they're still in the middle of it and they can't paint a clear picture. What I like to say for people who are in my workshops, this next program is designed to meet people both whether they have a story and they're still in the thick of it or whether they're wanting to tell it. Because both parts are like, how do I assign meaning to this and understand the value of like the hero's journey and make sense of it. And then if you are in a place where you're ready to share, great. You want to be out of the victim part of the process, out of the meaning making part of the process. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that for many folks in psychedelic experiences, which are one of the pathways towards shifting paradigms about the stories we tell ourselves and what we believe about ourselves, a lot of folks, when you start to tell stories in certain ways, that becomes the concrete narrative. And then it becomes, in a way, performative.
Hmm.
And I see this with folks. I see folks are like, well, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. What I tell folks is like, the moment that you try to put words onto it, to this experience that is not always encapsulated in words, you're automatically putting in some type of a container. and that container may not be reflective of like the contents of the experience. It's like at best a very limited like interpretation of whatever that might be. And so, this is tricky for folks because I also know, to your point about the like the raw content is that I think folks are beginning to understand that it actually takes a long time to kind of unravel meaning and story behind some of these experiences. Like the way that we think about a psychedelic trip a couple of days after is different than a couple of weeks after is different than a couple of months after, and then what remains, And I think it's really powerful for you where you were like, well, the story that you're telling yourself was that you were broken. And then I see that in so many people. And then for those folks, I always ask them, it's like, okay, well, if you feel like you're broken, do you believe that change is possible? Because whatever you believe here is what's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. As I finished my last sentence, I said, you probably shouldn't tell your story until you're done with your meaning making process, but I take it back because we're never done. I think your meaning making process is constantly evolving. And the way I tell certain stories has changed dramatically over the years. And I don't know if I would be able to tell stories if I didn't let myself tell them incorrectly,
Sure.
right? Like, in order
Like,
to iterate on a story, you got to have some building block. You got to have some formulation. And, I hear you on the idea of like, hey, we don't want to solidify and concretize our trip 2 days later because now you locked it into something. So I see the value of that. I'm not saying I disagree, but on the other hand, I like to give myself the room to just constantly play with it and re-evolve it and change it. What I have found personally, and this is actually something I just was writing about yesterday, and like I'm just starting to articulate this idea, but in order to metabolize and process, let's just say a lot of people are coming to me because they want to tell a story. And I'm like, if you want to tell a good story, you first need to metabolize and process the old story. And so give yourself permission to make the old, ugly, messy story with all the feeling the victim, all feeling like it was stacked against you and it's unfair, and bring all the I'm not good enoughs to the table so you can at least see them and understand what you're working with, which is a little bit different than what I think you were saying anyway. But it's just like, I really want to honor this process of let yourself be messy, let yourself be wrong, and hold it lightly.
yeah.
Don't coat it with a plaster and turn it into a statue that you stare at every day.
Dip it
Play
in
with it.
epoxy and put a light on it. Yeah.
This is not your shrine to how broken you are. However, it's very hard not to do that in the culture we live in because we're so disconnected from our body. So few people out there have, the model of how to get out of their head. And we just sit there and go, I'm broken, I need fixing, I'm broken, I need fixing. And people don't have other outlets on how to move it.
Yeah, my takeaway on what you're saying is that whether it's a rough draft or a final version, those are still very true iterations of the story. And that it may take a lot of rough drafts for you to arrive at what feels like true for you, of which it probably all felt true for you in the moment. And so I think that's an interesting concept because I see a lot of folks wanting to explore psychedelic experiences and it has to look a certain way or it has to like feel a certain. I mean, you even said it yourself, like you went through so many with it not working. But then you have a different perspective and then you go back and you're like, I'm noticing things that I didn't pick up the first time I watched this movie. It's like you can watch your favorite movie 100 times over the course of 10 years. And I'm noticing this now. I'm going back and watching older movies and things. It's like, that thing didn't make sense to me when I was 12. But now I'm watching it and I was like, that's what they're talking about. But it's the
Mm-hmm.
same movie. It's like almost like a different audience of myself, like watching it. It's really powerful. You do a lot of one of the things that I really appreciate you kind of infusing into this as I was talking about your work. One of the things, prior to us recording this episode is you were talking about the desire to like shift the narrative around mental health through art and story, but then also play. And I'm hearing that in a lot of what you're sharing. I'm a big believer in this too, that like levity and lightheartedness in the midst of a lot of like serious, deep work is actually super, super vital. And can you share more for this audience about what you mean by that around shifting the narrative around mental health? Like, I think we're kind of touching upon this now, but this idea of shifting the narrative around mental health through art, play, storytelling.
Yeah. I spent a lot of my life trying to fight the systems with this urgency of like, and guys, we should be afraid. And if we don't fight really hard, like it's all going to burn down around us. And nobody listens. And then I would see other people doing it. And I was like, oh, that's really like needy, hungry energy that feels desperate. And it's like not pleasant to be around, and Buckminster Fuller, to quote from him, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the old models obsolete.
Mm.
And like this is something that psychedelics have taught me so many times. When I create a new model, when I create from a different way, when I create something in a place of joy and inspiration and delight versus from obligation and fear and scarcity, that I am a lot more fun. I'm in my joy, I'm in my expression, I'm in my play, and I'm doing something that I believe in that will change the world, but I'm doing it from such a more fun, playful energy that is rejuvenating for me as well
Mm.
as others who come along. It's taken me some deep work to get to that place where I actually embody it some of the time. I haven't, I can't claim to have embodied it fully. I find myself slipping and going into this old workaholic zone quite a bit. But I think underneath at the core of it, I still am coming from this place of like, I deeply believe in what I'm doing and I don't get burned out the way I used to when I was coming from the fear and the scarcity. Fear and the scarcity would
Mm.
run me down completely. There was no regenerative energy. Where I'm operating now is like I finally found a way to kind of keep my center, and I work a lot, but I can hold it and I feel like I have some sense of balance as I'm doing it.
You're talking about something important, which is not only like the value of play and like coming from like your creative, like joyful place, but also I think it's like giving yourself a little bit of permission to have fun and like enjoy. I think there's a lot of folks who think about their mental health and think about mental health and psychedelic work where a lot of it feels like work, or folks who are like really rolling up their sleeves to do a lot of deep like trauma work and grief work and like really important stuff. And so I just acknowledge for some folks that joy and play can seem like really alien concepts for folks. And at the same time, I do believe it's very accessible to folks. Like I just worked with a client who was like ready to go to war with themselves in the psychedelic experience. They had a very pleasant and enjoyable experience that was also extremely impactful. And so I appreciate you like bringing that notion. And then you started telling me about the Sphinx Gate project and then a little bit about what I thought was fun, which is like the power of the quest. We were chatting about that a little bit. So can you break this down for folks? Like, what is this project, this immersive art project that you're bringing to Burning Man?
I love these extra layers you've just brought in. I don't know. I spent probably a good 10 years of that stretch before I found even when I did find psychedelics. I embarked on my healing journey almost like with a whip, flagellating myself, just like, you're not doing it good enough. You need to work harder. You need to heal faster. And, like I would wake up every morning and I would journal and I would like go try to do like yoga and I would do these things, but I was doing them in such a hard, mean way to myself. And a lot of my journeys then started later on showing me it's just like, when you yell at a kid and you're like, go harder, 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 that child that's not inspiring, right? Like
Yeah.
it is forcing something to go in a way which is just not sustainable, is not generative. What happens if we allow things to move from that sovereign place, from not being forced? And so, I went for 3 months and I lived in like almost total isolation. And I had to do this big, deep rewiring for myself where I took everything off my plate that I had, that I could. I had bare minimum of work that I needed just to put food on my plate. I was in Costa Rica. This is during COVID. I was able to like very, very little rent, very little everything. and ask myself, how am I coming to all my activities? Am I coming from a place of obligation? Am I forcing myself because I said I would?
Mm.
Because I'm afraid? Because I need to prove my worth? That was the big underlying thing, the big aha that shifted for me. Or can I come to things because I actually want to? And how does life change when I come to things because I deeply, like, it brings me joy and I believe in it with all my heart?
Of which this is one of the projects, right?
Now, this is one of the projects.
This is
So,
like one of the births of that state of like creativity that you find yourself in.
yeah. So basically, one of my other lessons was like, start creating, like, how can you create a culture that celebrates healing? How can we make it fun so that people don't have to suffer the way you did? And, I was biking across the playa in 2018, and I'm like, God, wouldn't it be cool if the Sphinxes from the Neverending Story were out here? And my friend is like, yeah, I'll help you. And I'm like, really? And then the next year, I was with a bunch of friends from MAPS, big players, people doing big things in the world. I'm like, guys, wouldn't it be cool if the Sphinxes were here? And they're like, yeah, we'll help you. I'm like, really? And I just started to realize this had steam. And so I put it on Facebook, and all these people responded and got engaged. And then I realized I had a real project here once all these people on the internet wanted to get involved. And so this is a project here. I'll give you the spiel, the shtick. The world is in a hard place, and we're all asking, what can we do to help? Kind of a big question that nobody has the answer to, kind of a riddle, right? And who to go to for riddles about the fate of humanity and the future of our earth better than sphinxes? Sphinxes, these mystical creatures that have shown up in many cultures, many different times. We don't know a lot about them, but one thing they have in common is that they invite humans to better know themselves. Carriers of riddles, inviting us humans to better know ourselves. And so we are bringing two sphinxes, two 34-foot tall sculptures of sphinxes, inspired by the film The Neverending Story, to Burning Man to invite humans to better know themselves. And there'll be an immersive, interactive art quest that 45 minutes to an hour, where people will collect their wisdom of their own lived experiences into a talisman through mind, body, breath, heart, community, destiny. And they'll bring this like wisdom representative to the feet of the sphinxes. Sphinxes are going to open their eyes, shoot lasers, and these individuals will then get a mission from an oracle that will help them continue their quest out into the greater world. And so the idea here is, how do we make it fun to work on ourselves? How can we reframe our struggles, our obstacles, our mental health battles, whatever they are? How is our challenge here to help us grow? And how do we learn who we are because of those challenges? And how do we do this in community? How do we make it fun? So that's the Sphinx Gate right there.
Yeah, instead of a list of chores or broken things that we need to resolve and fix, about ourselves. And yeah, I've been thinking about this whole like power of the quest since we started, chatting about that. And I think that's a really like wonderful lens on any type of work where folks are trying to really know themselves. I think ultimately that's one of the biggest arcs and themes that I see in people having psychedelic experiences. It's like, how can I better know myself so I can be in, as folks have heard on on this show, like be in better relationship with myself and like the world around me. So that's really exciting, and I know that you have that at the sphinxgate.com as well. And then I think the other thing that you do is the co-stewarding of the Global Psychedelic Society. Do you want to share with folks a little bit about that as well?
Yeah, thanks. Around the world, psychedelic communities have been gathering to talk about psychedelics and provide education, harm reduction, and integration circles. And right now, we've got over almost 300 on our map locator, but there was never like a unified hub that was like bringing everyone together to share resources and connect these societies to the greater ecosystem.
Mm.
And so, after a few years of bringing leaders together to conferences, Mike Margolies and I, and Jazz Kaddish, made this an official thing and created a website, and now have been. Yeah, we brought 70 leaders together for psychedelic science and did a one-day summit. And we're going to be doing another summit this year at Psychedelic Science. And, I think it's really important to name that more than 95% of psychedelic use is happening outside of the medicalized, legalized fields. More than 95%. And yet the resources for those folks is pretty limited.
Sure.
And there's not a lot of container. And what we found is that when community is part of the container, it's a lot more self-sustaining, regenerative. Again, we don't have to outsource our power to only to clinics. Like, not to, I don't want to knock clinics and retreat centers, and they're wonderful. These pieces are very important. But when you have the community to go back to when you're integrating, this is part of the medicine itself, right? Because isolation is such a problem with mental health. And once you're in community, you're not isolated.
Yeah, this desire for community is universal, obviously, to just human species and evolution. But regardless of what intersection of psychedelic care you find yourself in. And so, yeah, I think that's great. I love Mike and Jazz, and I think those are some great folks as well. So I'm really grateful. I mean, that's where I've landed too, continually, in how to create better systems for people to engage in psychedelics. There's always this peace and desire for community and being seen and being heard, and also allowing us to hear other stories. I think that that's the other really, really, I think, like, healing part of this, is that when we can hear that other people have gone through something similar to us, or, whatnot, it's like, oh, that's not just me.
Your story is a permission slip. You're giving each other permission to go through whatever that is, and showing the way as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Mareesa, for being on the show with us. This wraps up our episode. We'll drop a link in the episode description where we can find everything related to Mareesa Stertz. You can check out her website, yourstoryis.everything.com. Then there's the sphinxgate.com, and then globalpsychedelic.org as well. So, Mareesa, thank you so much for joining us on this episode.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Jimmy.
Thanks. All right, that wraps it up for us, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will see you next time on Psychedelic Passage podcast.